Hello, everybody. This is going to be Chapter 15, Part 1. What is freedom? Reconstruction. So, we're going to be looking at the time period following the Civil War, from about 1865 up through about 1877. So, we're going to start with the primary source from Congressman, future President James A. Garfield in 1865, who said, "What is freedom? Is it the bare privilege of not being chained? If that is all, then freedom is a bitter mockery, a cruel delusion." He's basically saying that freedom has to be more than just the negative of slavery. It's not just not slavery. It is, the rights and all the freedoms that come along with it as well. So, this time period immediately following the Civil War is called Reconstruction. It is rebuilding the South, connecting the South back to the North. But on top of that, and perhaps most importantly, it's also a time that raised very important questions regarding citizenship, voting rights, personhood, and freedoms, especially among recently released enslaved people. The early successes of Reconstruction that we're going to be taking a look at during this time are going to be spoiled by the failure of the country to fully protect African American rights. However, it did begin the longer process of codifying civil rights and instilling very specific freedoms into the Constitution. It's also the beginning of the civil rights movement in a big way. So let's talk about the meaning of freedom first, especially amongst African Americans following the Civil War. This question of what freedom is and what it meant overshadowed a lot of the time period of Reconstruction, especially for African Americans, but also for many white people, especially in the South. To many whites, freedom basically just meant the absence of slavery, and they were also very concerned about African Americans getting this new freedom. We'll talk about that later. However, others argued that true freedom for African Americans was not just the abolition of slavery, but it was the rights that had been lacked by African Americans up to this point, rights of citizenship, voting rights, ownership of property, all the things that were basically taken almost for granted by a lot of whites. Had been denied African Americans up to this point. And so these freedoms, these rights were important, integral, one might say, to the freedom, to the idea of freedom for African Americans. And so one of the big conflicts we're going to see in Reconstruction is around these differing views of what freedom truly meant. Now, for newly freed African Americans, escaping slavery was the first step, not the last step. They now had access to many things, like I said, the right to own land, the right to education, the right to work for wages, the right to not being separated from their families arbitrarily without their consent. These, like I said, had been simple and nearly, taken for granted opportunities and liberties for white people. However, they are now being enjoyed by black freemen in the South. They had the rights to do things like meet in public, have religious services without oversight, participate in commerce. We see that during this time, some African Americans are leaving the plantations, looking for better opportunities, although many of them are still looking in the South. We'll get to that later on when they start to move west as well. However, after the Civil War, many freedmen also strengthened the bonds of family. So, if you recall, during the pre-Civil War years, an enslaved person could be sold away from their family and never see them again, basically. And so during this time, many freedmen tried to reconnect with their family members. They placed ads in newspapers looking for long-lost relatives, fathers, sons, people they hadn't seen for decades. Ironically, freedom from slavery, however, also increased the belief within the African American community of the cult of domesticity, that a family should be a traditional family where women are in the home and not working, and men are in charge of bringing in money. It sort of locked women into the role of homemakers even in the African American community. However, as time goes on and we see the increase in poverty, African American women rejoin the workforce as an act of almost necessity. So here's a newspaper ad from 1886 where a woman is looking for her son, who she last saw 30 years before in 1853. Here also is a legally recognized marriage. Being allowed to be married and having it recognized by the law, not just and by the church, was a huge step forward in familial rights for African Americans. Now, freedom also meant the right to worship in black churches with black ministers. We see the rise of African Methodist Episcopal churches during this time period. We also see a strong desire amongst African Americans for education, particularly reading and training for future careers outside of just being like, a hired laborer. And these were essential for building stronger communities and also the possibility of growing your personal wealth. Groups of Northern volunteers worked with the Freedmen's Bureau, we'll get to them in just a moment, to create schools that were open to free African Americans of all ages. So these were not just schools for children, these were schools for anyone who wanted to come and get an education. And so we see in this picture right here of this Freedmen's School that several of the people who are going to this school are not children but grown adults. We also see the rise of private black colleges during this time. The goal was to educate young African Americans to become future leaders in their communities and in the country. These colleges, now called historically black colleges and universities, included places like Fisk in Tennessee, Hampton Institute in Virginia, and one of the most famous HBCUs is Howard University in Washington, D.C., but there are many more across the country. So this is Howard University, founded in 1867. It was named after Oliver Howard, who was the first commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau. And many HBCUs, we consider them sort of a post-Civil War thing. However, the first HBCU was actually founded in 1837, and that was Cheyney University in Pennsylvania. Now, as far as political freedom goes, according to Frederick Douglass, he said slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot. After freeing the slaves, there were still a lot of questions about, okay, African Americans are not enslaved anymore. They are not enslaved. But what are they? Who are they? What is their citizenship? What rights do they have? These questions were not answered by the 13th Amendment. And so they wanted to be answered, but they were not answered yet. And so one of the things that we see is the call for black suffrage, the right for African Americans to vote. And so freedmen's would gather and hold conventions and petition the government for the right to vote. This was a huge part of the post-Civil War movement. We also see during this time that the idea of freedom is very closely associated with owning land. Think back to this is very almost Jeffersonian. The idea that to be a landowner is to have your citizenship almost guaranteed. And so the call for land was one of the first rights called for by African Americans. Even before the Civil War was over, a group of advocates met with William Tecumseh Sherman, general of the Union Army, and he said basically, it looks like the war is winding down. What do you all want? And they told him they wanted land of their own. In response to this, William Tecumseh Sherman released a special field order called Field Order Number 15, which called for thousands of acres of Confederate land. The Confederates had fled off the land to be given to enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, in 40-acre plots. This became known as 40 acres and a mule. However, this promise proved only to be temporary, as we're going to see. Eventually, the President of the United States revokes this and ends this 40 acres and a mule. Nowadays, 40 acres and a mule almost has the connotations of a broken promise. Now, this land that was either given or claimed by freedmen, African Americans' families were living in much larger houses than they used to, and they started to spread out a lot more. They used to be forced to live in very cramped quarters, very close together. African Americans were now claiming a lot of the freedoms that had been taken almost as a given by whites up to this point, and saying that we deserve a lot of these same rights that have been given to whites for ourselves. And they wanted land, they wanted political participation, they wanted economic opportunities. So here we see a plantation before and after the Civil War. And if you notice before, the slave quarters are very closely together. And in 1881, we see that they have spread all over the plantation. And we also see a church and a school has grown up in the left-hand side there. Now, the Civil War, looking at not just African Americans, but at whites during this time, the Civil War had devastated, destroyed white Southerners. More than 260,000, about one-fifth of the male population of the South, had died during the war. And the South had come out of it with absolutely nothing to show for it, and with a complete change in their lifestyle as well. We'll talk about this a little bit when we get to how the South viewed the Civil War, what we call the lost cause. The war also had destroyed many of the southern cities, and many farms and many animals and livestock and machinery were destroyed by the war. This meant that the economic and mental and spiritual recovery would be very long and very difficult. So, for instance, here is the evacuation of Richmond, Virginia at the end of the war. If you're wondering why the city is on fire, that's because the Confederates lit it on fire on their way out. Here is Richmond after the evacuation, though, so we see just the absolute devastation of a lot of these southern cities. Many wealthy plantation families had fled for their lives, and when they came back, they realized that they were broke. They had donated most of their money to the Confederate war effort, and so that money was now gone. And this meant for the first time that wealthy plantation owners were forced to work for themselves, which just sounds terrible. Sorry, trying to gain a little sympathy for them, or empathy, I guess, but the idea that slave owners were being forced to work for the first time is you know, that's something new for them. To many Southern families, the idea of black freedom also was completely against odds with their idea of what freedom was. Freedom for them meant the freedom to own slaves, basically, and to control the work of others. This was freedom. This new freedom was completely off the wall to them. Now, to white Northerners, especially Northern Republicans, the idea of freedom and the vision of the South they had was basically to turn the South into a new North, to institute free labor. Now, free labor means that basically everyone is working freely for their own benefit. In the Northern mindset, freedmen would work harder because they were now working for themselves and getting paid, and not being forced into work for other people. Meanwhile, Southern cities, in the mindset of Northern whites, would come to resemble Northern cities. There would be schools and factories, and not these big plantations anymore, but smaller independent farms instead. Now, this set up a divide amongst, what white Northerners wanted, what white Southerners wanted, and what Northern and Southern freedmen wanted for the first time. And so we see there is a lot of division around here. And it really fell to a group called the Freedmen's Bureau, established by Congress in 1865, to try to create this northern vision of the South, and also to empower African Americans at the same time. So the job of the Freedmen's Bureau was big. Bureau agents were expected to be mediators between whites and free blacks in the South. They were expected to establish schools, and they were expected to ensure the fair treatment of African Americans in the Southern court system. So, big job for a small Freedmen's Bureau. The Bureau also only lasted for about 5 years, from 1865 to 1870, and then it was killed by Andrew Johnson. During this time, the Bureau was able to create gains in education and healthcare, create nearly 3,000 schools and over 150,000 students within the South. So here we see this is sort of almost a metaphor of what the jobs of the Freedmen's Bureau is. It's to stand in between these two warring factions, Southern whites and Southern African Americans, and sort of be the peacemakers for both sides. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau attempted to create land reform as well, continuing this whole idea of 40-acre plots, 40 acres and a mule. However, after Abraham Lincoln's death, Andrew Johnson, the new president, revoked this new land reform and said that all land should be returned to the former Southern farm owners. Now, most freedmen were evicted during this time, and they were forced into their pre-war jobs. They were working on plantations for little to no pay and very little chance of advancement. This betrayal also created a lot of resentment amongst free blacks towards the American government, who they felt had sort of stabbed them in the back after promising them new land and new opportunities. Now, in this new system, we see that a lot of African Americans were forced into what has become known as sharecropping. This was the idea that they weren't enslaved necessarily, and they weren't also paying money because money was not a big commodity at the time. Instead, African American and also white families who were sharecroppers would rent a section of the plantation, grow their own crops, and they would share the crops with the plantation owner. After the harvest, they would give some of their crops that they had harvested to the owner of the plantation, and sold whatever they had left. Now, the problem with this is, while it allowed African American families to work without white supervision, it also severely limited the chances of economic advancement. When you're selling half or more of your crop, you're losing basically every single year. And like I said, there were also many poor whites who were forced into sharecropping by this new economy at the same time. Now, here are some Southern sharecroppers of this time period. While the South was struggling economically after the Civil War, we do see some advancements within Southern cities. So the growth of railroads meant that major cities like Atlanta were connected by these trains to the American North. And this created a new middle class of merchants and bankers and railroad workers who got rich off of the interstate trade. However, the devastation of the Civil War in the long term transformed the South in a variety of ways, economically, socially, politically, culturally, spiritually, in a lot of ways even. So this was the post-war era in the South was a huge thing. And one of the things we're going to see is that for white Southerners, they had to justify their loss, and we're going to get to that with the historical idea of the lost cause. So here's what Atlanta looked like in 1887. It is a city being rebuilt in a lot of ways. Now, let's look at the making of radical Reconstruction. So, let's start with non-radical Reconstruction. That would be Andrew Johnson. After Lincoln's assassination, Reconstruction fell to his vice president. Andrew Johnson was born into poverty. He was a Southerner. He didn't learn how to read until his wife taught him how to read. However, he became a very powerful Southern politician before the Civil War. He was known for his hatred of the wealthy planter class. He was also a firm supporter of the Union. He was the only senator from a state that was seceding that didn't leave with his state. This made him a great symbol for the Union in the South, and this is why he basically got the vice presidential job in Lincoln's second term. So here's our 17th president, Andrew Johnson, 1865 to 69, born in North Carolina but moved to Tennessee, where he was a congressman, he was a governor. During the Civil War, he became the military governor of Tennessee, and later on became vice president in 1864. Now, he was not a Republican. Democrats and Republicans sort of joined up during the 1864 election to create the Union Party to help finish the Civil War. So this will be important. Andrew Johnson is very different from Lincoln in a lot of ways, including politically. He's also the only president who was elected to the U.S. Senate after he was done being president. Now, Johnson and Lincoln's had very different opinions of African Americans and very different ideas of what Reconstruction should look like. Andrew Johnson was very stubborn, in many ways intolerant, uncompromising. He didn't have Lincoln's gift to get people on his side. He was also a very strong supporter of states' rights and also held very deeply racist views of African Americans, and this is going to be an issue up later on. This meant that Andrew Johnson had a very different method when it came to Reconstruction. Johnson took control of Reconstruction in 1865 after the death of Lincoln, and he held on to power basically until 67, when the radical Republicans took over. But during his time, Andrew Johnson pardoned most white Southerners who had taken an oath of allegiance to the United States, including a lot of Confederate soldiers. The only ones he did not pardon were Confederate leaders and wealthy planters. And that was partially because, again, he didn't like wealthy planter aristocrats. He kind of wanted them to come to him personally and beg. And so this is partially why he didn't pardon them immediately. Meanwhile, Johnson was also acknowledging that while the 13th Amendment stood and slavery was over and emancipation had happened, he was not interested in promoting the rights of African Americans. He was calling for new state constitutions being written entirely by white Southerners. He gave Southern states free rein on how they wanted to run Reconstruction, and this led to many ex-Confederates being elected to Congress. It also started to see an increase in violence against Southern African Americans. So here's Andrew Johnson in a political cartoon doing a ring trick, uniting the North and South. Now, during this time, when the Southern states had the opportunity to sort of run Reconstruction and run the welcoming back into the Union as they saw fit, a lot of Southern states jumped at this opportunity to restrict the rights of African Americans and try to return them to a system that was slavery in basically everything but name. So we see the rise of new Southern laws called black codes in many Southern states that gave, that basically reduced the rights and freedoms of African Americans. They had certain limited freedoms, like they were still allowed to get married, they were allowed to own some property, they had the right to appear in court, but they could not testify in court against white people, they could not vote. They said that basically African Americans who were not signed up to work for a certain white person could be arrested and forced into work for white landowners. It also wrote several laws against what was known as miscegenation, the mixing of the races. These new laws, which were sort of implied to be allowed by President Johnson, really angered a lot of Northern Republicans who felt that Johnson was sort of selling out Southern African Americans. However, Johnson also ensured that many Confederate soldiers were not being tried for their crimes. In fact, only one major Confederate soldier was executed following the war. Johnson also very quickly demobilized the Union Army, and sort of the South was left without a babysitter. Without this Army supervision, a lot of African Americans were threatened by Southern white supremacists. This is the rise of the Ku Klux Klan during this time as well. And all of this led many radical Republicans, these sort of Republicans who were much more abolitionist and now pro-African American rights, to call for Congress to be in charge of Reconstruction, not the president, because the president seemed to be screwing it up. So, by December of 1865, Johnson said that the Union had been reunited. He had finished the work. Radical Republicans were not on board with this, and they called for a new reconstruction of the South based on harsher punishments, more guarantees for black rights, and we see this with Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. You remember him from a couple chapters ago where he was nearly beaten to death with a cane, and also a guy named Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. Stevens actually proposed a law to confiscate white land in the South and give it to African Americans. However, this law failed. Here is Thaddeus Stevens, by the way, 1792 to 1868, born in Vermont but lived a good chunk of his life in Pennsylvania, where he was a soldier, a lawyer and a congressman. Now, it was rumored that Thaddeus Stevens, one of the reasons that he was so pro-African American was because he had a long-term relationship with his African American housekeeper for over 20 years. That has never been proven. He also was known to wear badly fitting wigs during his time. In a famous story, Thaddeus Stevens was at a party once, and a woman asked for a lock of his hair, and instead of just a lock, the guy took off his wig and plopped it into her hands and said, "Madam, you may have the whole thing." Now, after the radical Republicans took control of Reconstruction away from Johnson, they refused to seat these new Southern congressmen who they felt were going to destroy the whole thing. A lot of these new congressmen from the South were ex-Confederate politicians and soldiers, so they were like, nope, you do not get to sit in Congress. The radical Republicans and their allies worked to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau and also worked to pass the new Civil Rights Bill of 1866. This is a very important new bill. It defined what a citizen of our country is. Basically, this had never really been done before. It said that a citizen of our country is somebody who is born in these United States or has been naturalized. It called for equality of all races before the law as well. However, Andrew Johnson, the president, vetoed both of these laws. This killed the Freedmen's Bureau dead. It ran out of money in 1870. However, Congress was able to override Johnson's veto and to pass the Civil Rights Bill. And this was the first of many laws passed by radical Republicans over Johnson's veto. This is the way they would go. They would pass a law, Johnson would veto it, they'd override the veto. This happened consistently. So, here is Andrew Johnson kicking out the Freedmen's Bureau in a political cartoon. But we see that this kind of worried radical Republicans as well. The idea that, the Civil Rights Bill was almost killed. They realized they didn't just want this to be a law. Laws can be overturned. It's a lot harder to change the Constitution. And so instead, Congress passed the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in order to make sure that citizenship was defined within the Constitution as anyone who was born here. Except for Native Americans. Anyone born in America are citizens of our country, and Congress has the ability to defend the rights of all citizens. It also had a second part that is important these days because it's actually being used to contest whether or not people who were involved in the January 6th attack on the Capitol are allowed to hold public office anymore. It said that if you take part in a conspiracy against your country, if you take part in a rebellion, you are not allowed to hold public office anymore. However, also important foreshadowing note, the 14th Amendment did not say anything about voting rights for African Americans. Now, in an attempt to stop states from electing more radical Republicans in 1866, Andrew Johnson actually traveled the country, making huge accusations, wild sort of conspiratorial accusations that radical Republicans were trying to assassinate him. This did not help him out. It made him look like he was actually a little bit insane. And so anti-Johnson Republicans won a major victory in the fall of 1866. In 1867, again over Andrew Johnson's veto, the Republicans passed what's called the Reconstruction Act, which said, let's bring the Army back to the South. It divided the South into 5 military zones. It said that they're going to be looked over by, 5 generals, and it also called for the election of black politicians, which we will start to see as well. So here are the 5 military zones of military reconstruction and the 5 generals that ran them. Now, this did not end conflict between Johnson and Congress. In 1867, Congress passed what's called the Tenure of Office Act, which said that presidents could not fire certain office holders without congressional approval, including their cabinet members. Now, this was partially because they wanted to keep their ally, Edwin Stanton, as Secretary of War, but it was also a bit of like a test balloon. It was testing the waters. It was almost daring Andrew Johnson to defy them and to fire somebody, like see what happens, basically. And Johnson took that bait. He fired Edwin Stanton in 1868 in defiance of the Tenure of Office Act. He said the Tenure of Office Act was unconstitutional. In response to this, Congress, for the first time ever, started proceedings for impeachment of the President of the United States. Impeachment is putting the president on trial by the Senate for criminal misconduct. If the president is found guilty, they can be removed from office, and that's what Johnson was being tried for. Now, while most Republicans did not like Johnson, there were some who worried about like setting this precedent of, oh, you can just vote out any president you don't like. So Andrew Johnson was put on trial. However, he was found not guilty by one singular vote in the U.S. Senate. So here is Andrew Johnson being put on trial in the impeachment. You can see a lot of people up there in the crowd. This is a ticket for the impeachment of Johnson. It was a hot ticket to get at the time. Now, after this very close call, Andrew Johnson basically said, okay, you guys can run Reconstruction however you feel like it. Johnson also said he was not going to run for re-election in 1868. And so in 1868, Ulysses S. Grant was elected president over Horatio Seymour, the former governor of New York. He partially did it by sort of talking about his war record and claiming that he was a war hero and reminding the Northerners of the treason of the South. This is sometimes called waving the bloody shirt, allegedly because there was a guy, not Grant, but another guy, who literally waved his bloody shirt from the Civil War during this time. And Reconstruction had been one of the major points of division during the 1868 election. So here's our new president, Ulysses S. Grant, 1869 to 77. He was born in Ohio but moved all over the country, including to St. Louis. He was the commanding general of the U.S. Army and acting Secretary of War. He had not been a politician up to the time he was president of the United States. And he was also supposed to be allegedly at Ford's Theater the night of Lincoln's assassination. He was also a target for assassination by John Wilkes Booth and his co-conspirators. However, it was Grant's wife, and the fact that Grant's wife hated Mrs. Lincoln that saved his life that night, possibly. The drama, the tea between these two women possibly saved Ulysses S. Grant. Now, very quickly after Grant became president, Congress passed the 15th Amendment, which basically guaranteed voting rights for all men regardless of race. It prohibited the government from denying anyone the right to vote because of race. But in spite of this new law, there were loopholes that the South used to stop people from getting the right to vote. They passed laws that created literacy tests that were impossible to pass for African Americans. They had property qualifications and poll taxes where you had to pay a certain amount in order to vote, and most African Americans did not have the money. Of course, one of the big things, and we'll talk about this more in class, is that women did not have the right to vote, and this really helped to divide the abolition or the African American rights movement from the women's rights movement. However, the 15th Amendment, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, while incomplete, are seen as a huge step forward in African American rights and liberties during this time. And we will finish up Chapter 15 next time.